So in today's video, we are going to talk about how to reparent as a massive part of your healing if you're a fearful avoidant attachment style. And this really applies to everybody, but we're doing a series on this, just all about reparenting as a whole, why it matters, what it actually is. And I'm going to take you through, first and foremost, a little bit of a synopsis for what reparenting is, but then I'm going to take you through an exercise that's literally going to be all about how to reparent yourself. Okay, so some really important parts specifically around some of our most deeply unmet needs. And if you watch the intro video to this whole series, we also talked about limerence and reparenting and how these two things go hand in hand. So you can check that out too if you've missed it. So first and foremost, to really dive into the topic of reparenting, we need to define what it is, okay? And one of my favorite quotes that relates to reparenting is from Dr. Gabor Maté. And Dr. Gabor Maté says, trauma are two things: the things that happened that shouldn't have happened, but also the things that didn't happen that should have happened. What does that mean? Well, trauma on one hand is the obvious, right? The things that happened that shouldn't have happened. If somebody was in an abusive relationship, right, or had a really unhealthy childhood where somebody was constantly screaming at them, or, these things, those are the obvious, right? The things that happened that shouldn't have happened. In a perfect world, that would not be taking place in a household. But it's also the things that didn't happen that should have happened. For example, if you grow up in a household where there's complete neglect, children are wired for attachment, for attunement, for closeness, for connection. They're wired to need to feel like they belong to somebody, like they're at the center of somebody's universe, like it's safe to be themselves and to connect and to lean on somebody. And if somebody grows up in a household where there's an absence of that, that is also traumatic. But those are usually the traumas that are more hidden, right? That are more subtle, that people don't recognize as much because they're not so overt and obvious. It's more about the things that are deeply missing. So how this relates to reparenting is literally about us as adults. And I really believe this. I believe that this is an important rite of passage that we all go through, that some people spend their whole lives not even knowing. But I believe that we all have a rite of passage where we have to be able to give to ourselves what we didn't get. In other words, we have to become our own parents. And until you do, you will find yourself in a position where you resent or get frustrated for things you didn't have and blame other people in your life for it. Now, I want to break this down, okay? There's this old quote, and this quote says, the more dependency that we have fostered on another person, the more likely it is that that person will eventually become our adversary. What does that mean? Well, the more dependency that you have on another person, the more you're essentially going to expect a lot from them, right? You need them to do things for you because you depend on them. But people are not perfect, and they're definitely not mind readers, and they're not always going to get it right. So then the moment that person doesn't get it right, we suffer. And who do we blame the suffering on? The person we're hyper dependent on. And thus, as a result of that, you're going to find that that person in your mind then becomes your adversary. Now, you see this across all these different places. You see this with a parent and child and how much this pertains to the idea of reparenting. You see this in, a workplace with an employer-employee. You see this between very codependent partners in relationships. That is something that is deeply aligned. Okay, these are things that really have their roots here. So how do we stop that from happening? Well, I think that it's also equally important to recognize that the things in our own personal lives that we struggle with the most because we weren't parented around these things in a healthy way are the very same things that we tend to or try to outsource the most onto others. Let me give you an example. Let's say you're an anxious attachment style, just to make the example very clear. And let's say that you are in a position where you didn't get proper consistency growing up. So you didn't learn to self-soothe. Well, because you're in learned helplessness, you don't have that foundation of knowing how to soothe yourself. Guess what you do? You outsource it onto other people. You're like, everybody should soothe me. My partner should be responsible for how I feel. If you're a fearful avoidant and you had your internal baseline of trust fragmented or fractured, you didn't learn to trust because you didn't see healthy consistency or congruency in your upbringing. Well, then what do? You're like, nobody ever can tell any lie, or nobody can ever be incongruent. If the story changes, oh my gosh, it's a violation. And we put a lot of pressure on those things because we are trying to get everybody to be perfect around us to solve for the fact that we don't know how to trust, right? And that was my experience when I was a fearful avoidant. I was like, everybody's story better line up, every detail better line up all the time because I don't want to have to feel like these wounds of trust. Now, as a dismissive avoidant, a lot of dismissive avoidants are like, I need the perfect partner where there's no conflict ever, because a lot of dismissive avoidants don't know how to move through conflict. Okay, so how does this all come into reparenting? How does this connect back? Well, we have to learn to self-source in healthy ways, even for dismissive avoidance, the things that we didn't get healthy conditioning around. And that is a huge form of reparenting. So let's go back to this idea that trauma are the things that happened that shouldn't have happened, okay? But also the things that didn't happen that needed to happen, okay? On the one hand, this is kind of more obvious, right? The things that happened that shouldn't have happened. The reparenting process for this is to look at the things that were painful to you and what you made them mean about yourself, okay? Every time we go through a traumatic event or a painful situation, we give meaning to that event about ourselves. So as an example, if a dismissive avoidant growing up was shamed for being vulnerable and expressing their emotions, they were told, oh, don't be such a crybaby. Children should be seen and not heard. Get out of here. We don't have time for this. Don't be such a baby. Like these types of things, a child goes, okay, my emotions are shameful. Thus, because these are an inherent part of myself, I am shameful. I am defective. And I am weak if I show these things. Now, guess what some of the biggest core wounds are that create this dysfunction in a relationship that the dismissive avoidant has with themselves as an adult and thus with other people? These core wounds, these ideas that I'm defective or something's wrong with me or I'm weak if I show too much of my emotion. Okay. And then what happens is, as an adaptation to believing, thinking, feeling these things because of their own early conditioning, not because they chose that, not because they raised their hand and said, this is how I'd like to feel for my whole life, because that was literally how they were taught to be conditioned. Okay. Those are the patterns that literally got conditioned into them. Dismissive avoidants go to great lengths as adults to hide themselves, to not be seen, to not really share their emotions, because that's how they've adapted to that conditioning. Okay. Now, the root of rewiring that is to rewire those belief systems. Okay, we're not born with these belief systems. They get fired and wired into us through repetition and emotion over time. It's that firing and wiring, that repetition and emotion that actually create those neural pathways and neural networks. And we have to change the story and do it repeatedly enough that we stop believing that. We have to see how emotions are strong and courageous, or vulnerabilities takes a lot of courage and it connects us instead of gets us shamed and seen as weak, right? So we have to be able to change that narrative within ourselves is a big step towards healing. I have a lot of videos on this channel about that, so I'm not going to go too far into that right now. I'm going to focus on this video on the other form of reparenting, which is giving to ourselves what we didn't get. So I want to take you through this exercise because this is actually going to blow your mind a little bit, I think. I'm hoping that this is like a huge aha moment for you. Okay, so what I want to do here is share my screen and just take you through this exercise specifically as it relates to needs, because this has such a massive impact. So first and foremost, reparenting, when it comes to the fearful avoidant attachment style, it's about the conditioning you receive from childhood. Okay, so I'm almost going to highlight these because they're 3 separate steps and we're going to go through them here together. Okay, so first and foremost, I am curious, and this is the first question I want you to fill in the blanks with, but I'll give some examples for fearful avoidance. What are the deepest unmet needs you had in your childhood experience? And usually for fearful avoidance, you'll see things like the following. Okay, you might see lack of emotional or even physical safety. So you might see this lack of emotional or physical safety. You also might see a lot of unmet needs around trust, right? Like a lot of either broken promises or inconsistencies or incongruencies, where one person says something, the other person says something else, or a parent says, I'm going to show up and follow through in this area, but then they can't because they have their own issues or struggles going on. So trust is usually huge. A feeling of feeling like you are seen, heard, like your own needs are acknowledged, understood, a need for just healthy boundaries or domain. And you'll generally see as well some other really unmet needs fearful avoidants have in their childhood are feeling like connection can be safe. That kind of goes back to physical, emotional safety, and feeling like they are wanted or acknowledged in their own upbringing. Okay. So these are usually really big pieces. Now, let's pick some of the major ones. I'm not going to go through every single one, but I want you to write yours. It can be these, it can be other things, but just take a moment and be like, what did I really need in my childhood that I just feel like I didn't get access to? And then what you're going to do is in this sort of column next to it, or under the next question, you're going to score how much you give these things to yourself from 1 to 10. So how much do you make yourself feel physically and emotionally safe? And if you find that you're in this like kind of volatile position where you've got a lot of like ups and downs in your life, things like that, then you're probably going to find physical emotional safety be quite low. If you have a really dysregulated nervous system where you're always operating from fight or flight, again, you're probably going to see physical and emotional safety be quite low on the totem pole. The huge one, right? Like we talked about trust. Trust. How much do you meet your own needs for trust from 1 to 10? I know that when I was a fearful avoidant attachment style, I didn't even realize how often I was betraying my own trust by getting into situations where I would put my needs last. I wouldn't set boundaries. I would say yes to something that was actually a no for me. I would violate my own trust by, trying to commit to something and not being able to follow through, not being able to actually show up for the things that matter to me in my life. So, for me, when I was fearful of avoidant, I would have scored like a 1 or a 2 maybe out of 10 at showing up in ways that were allowing me to foster healthy self-trust, right? I wouldn't trust my intuition or my gut because I wouldn't listen to my own feelings, right? So a lot of these things you'll start to see. And again, how much do you make yourself feel seen and heard? How much do you listen to and attune to your own emotions? How much do you acknowledge yourself, your wins, the way you are showing up? How much are you understanding or kind to yourself in your internal dialogue, right? So a lot of, we can call this actually compassion or kindness is another usually huge one that fearful avoidants are missing. So what you'll see is usually the way that you were conditioned or parented, right? You struggle to give to yourself in healthy ways, right? You struggle to give anything different than that, right? You basically become your parent to yourself, okay, is another way of putting it. And what that means realistically is that you're basically just the byproduct of conditioning. You're literally basically just like your genetic predisposition plus your conditioning until you get to a point where you're like, oh, I'm going to choose to consciously evaluate my subconscious patterns here and actually practice rewiring the things that I didn't get access to. Okay. So just again, think of trust, safety, like maybe you're giving yourself a 3 out of 10, compassion to yourself, or kindness, maybe you're scoring like a 1 or a 0. So again, just I want you to go through and see what shows up for you. These are just some random examples that do commonly tend to happen with fearful avoidance, and then score yourself from 1 to 10 there. Okay. And then what we're going to do is I'm going to ask you, how can you start giving these things to yourself? Now, I do want to say, as I go into this, and we're going to talk in a minute about how these things also impact deeply who you're going to choose in partnership. But I do want to say that if you are somebody who struggles to give these things to yourself, you're going to end up finding yourself investing in people who also struggle to give them to you, because ultimately we choose what's familiar, and what's most familiar is the relationship we have to ourselves. If you do want help, by the way, before we go through the latter half of this video in detail, if you want help diving into these things, we also have a full reparenting course that you can check out absolutely free for more than enough time that you'll need to get through it. You can get a 7-day free trial. You can get a 14-day membership. You can get a full month membership fully for free by spinning this little wheel down below. We have this cool little promotion just happening for this month. So if you spin to win, you'll get one of those things. And then when you enter into your dashboard, just type in reparenting, that course will come up. It actually gives you access to all the PDS courses, but this one will be a really meaningful one if you're struggling with this and just want more support beyond this, with the workbook and all the different exercises. So the next thing here is like, how do you learn to give yourself trust, right? So if you're struggling, if you have no self-trust because your trust was broken growing up and you were conditioned to not have trust to begin with, how can you start rebuilding trust? Well, so much of rebuilding trust in the relationship to yourself is a few crucial things. It's learning to be consistent in the relationship to yourself. So consistency, congruency. So what you say you're going to do for yourself, you do. If you say, I'm going to set a boundary, you go set a boundary. You don't say, oh, one day I'd like to set a boundary and never follow through, right? Because then you're just breaking promises to self. In other words, damaging your own self-trust. Context, the more you understand yourself, and the more context you have for things, why you do the things that you do, what the root causes are, the more you're like, oh, I understand myself. The more you have understanding of yourself, the easier it is to trust yourself, that you're not like, trying to do wrong by yourself, but just instead understanding cause and effect. But most importantly, consideration. This is like the biggest way to rebuild self-trust, is to learn to consider yourself before making decisions, right? Don't just say yes because you have this compulsive need to people please. Say, hey, if somebody asks you to do something, check in with yourself. Do I want to do that? Let me consider how I'm feeling here for a second. Okay, I actually don't want to do that. So it's a no, right? So you want to be able to self-consider. Safety, you want to rebuild safety in the relationship to yourself. This is so much about like nervous system regulation, learning to get into parasympathetic nervous system mode or rest and digest mode through meditation or breath work or yoga or light exercise on a daily basis, things that connect you back to your body and get you in your body. And then compassion, right? Learning to be kinder to yourself or reframe your negative thoughts in your internal dialogue, right? There can be a lot of like harshness, fearful avoidance have in their own internal dialogue. So, what you would do here is you would practice committing to these things across at least a 21-day period, because that gives us enough repetition and emotion to start really solidifying new neural pathways and thus new patterns. But these things are going to be the way that you can get out of just repeating your same old conditioned patterns and then finding like there's this frustration or resentment happening in your life because you keep seeing these same types of themes emerge. Okay. So if you're somebody who's truly interested in helping others while also securing financial freedom for your future, there is a limited time option to join our 50% off certified relationship coach program. And this is a 12-week program where you can create financial freedom, work from anywhere in the world, and truly make an impact on other individuals' lives by becoming a certified relationship coach in just 12 weeks. Throughout this entire 12 weeks, you will learn all of the tools that you need to discover somebody's attachment style and help them heal and change their attachment style if they are insecurely attached so that they can become secure and build the best relationships of their life. On top of that, you'll learn all about the subconscious mind and how to actually rewire our painful limiting beliefs, our painful behavioral patterns, and help your clients learn their relationship needs, as well as the needs of their loved ones. You'll also learn how to build a thriving coaching practice and set yourself up for long-term success. You'll learn all of the business tips and tools you need to build funnels, leverage marketing strategies, and really thrive in the marketplace. Even if you have absolutely no coaching experience, this certification will give you everything you need starting from scratch to become a thriving relationship coach. You can find more using the link down below. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe so you don't miss the other videos in this series. Share this with somebody who might benefit. And thank you so much for watching.